Good evening. The Architects Council would like to thank the Department of City Planning for their cooperation in creating the seminar and providing our two speakers. We have tonight Frank Rochella Jr., who is the Director for Zoning at the Department of City Planning and has been with the agency since 2007. He has recently been overseeing the implementation of the administration's City of Yes zoning changes and previously led efforts to update the zoning resolution to promote goals such as affordable housing, coastal resiliency, and transit accessibility. Frank holds master's degrees in urban planning and architecture from Harvard's Graduate School of Design and a bachelor in urban studies from Rutgers University. We also have Mr. Chris Hayner, who is the Deputy Director for Zoning at the New York City Department of City Planning. He has most recently been a core member of all the City of Yes text amendments, which have sought to promote carbon neutrality, economic opportunity, and housing opportunity to the 5 boroughs. He has been with the agency since 2008 and has worked on a myriad of citywide text and neighborhood plans. Chris holds master's degrees in real estate development and urban planning from NYU and Columbia, respectively, and a bachelor's degree in architecture from Syracuse. It is with great interest that we welcome them to speak with us tonight.
It is amazing to see a crowd this large wanting to talk about zoning. You can't hear us? Let's see. Can you hear us now? Better. All right. It's great seeing a crowd this large wanting to talk about zoning. It's a very rare thing for us. What we were going to do today is go through each of the 3 City of Yes text amendments, go through in some detail, particularly the first 2, because they've been recently approved, and it's helpful to just go through and make sure everyone understands the rules that are now in place. And then from there, talk about the Housing Opportunity Text Amendment, which is still in public review and will be at least probably till the end of the year. I'll start. Mark, I think when we were talking about this, wait for questions to the end. Does that make sense to you? However we want? All right. If you have questions as we're going through, raise your hands. It's fine. We'll just cover it as we go. It'll make it a little bit easier. This is a lot of information. There's been a lot of zoning change undertaken over like the last 2 years. We have barely slept. And so it's sort of useful to try to go through this and describe what's actually happened.
Let me just interrupt then.
The zoning.
If we're going to raise your hand, wait, we'll bring a mic over to you so that you can then make your question and everybody can hear it.
Okay, ready? All right. So in the beginning, as the new Adams administration came into office, it is important to remember, because we're still sort of living with it, but the city was dealing with a number of crises, both from a climate crisis, the pandemic and recovery from the pandemic, and sort of the continuous ongoing housing crisis in the city. And one of the things that the department decided to try to take on was to say, how could zoning be used as a tool to try to address these things? It's obvious zoning can't solve all of these problems, but there are at least things that in the zoning resolution could be changed that could try to help. That really was the goal that we've had over the last few years, to try to think about that in the zoning resolution as a whole. So that led to 3 individual citywide zoning text amendments. The first, carbon neutrality, which was approved actually last year, right at the end of the year, looking at all the different ways that the zoning resolution was impeding the city's ability to meet its climate goals. Economic opportunity, which was really looking at all of the different ways that the zoning resolution was getting in the way of businesses in the city growing and locating. That was approved in June of this year. and Housing Opportunity, which began its public review in April of this year with the idea that it would be approved, hopefully approved, in December of, or by December of the end of this year. The other thing that I think we took as sort of in addition to trying to address these sort of massive goals in the city, there was also a recognition, I think, from our part, having dealt with the zoning resolution, having worked on editing the zoning resolution, and hearing from practitioners over the years, that the zoning resolution is kind of a mess. This sort of photo of a closet kind of looks like what the zoning resolution feels like to us sometimes. There's lots of contradictory things. There's things that you find buried in chapters that you had no idea were there. That still happens to us 17 years later. And that, like, maybe in doing these big projects, we can try to address some of those issues that have really been around sometimes since the 1940s, sometimes since the 1960s, and upwards until today. So there was that goal too, that like our sense was if we could make this better, not just to try to achieve these goals, but try to make the use of the zoning resolution better for practitioners, and maybe clean this closet up a little bit. So I'll start with carbon neutrality. And the goal of this text amendment at its core was to really comb through the resolution and identify any of those areas where it seemed that zoning could be getting in the way of the city meeting its climate goals. And those goals really focus on 4 key areas. There's both trying to change and sort of expand the electrical grid in the city, both from a production of energy and storage of energy perspective. Buildings and how buildings need to be retrofitted to lower their energy use to support overall climate goals. Similarly, beginning to move toward electric vehicles, not only cars, but also e-mobility like with bikes. And then finally, while zoning doesn't often deal with waste, there are some times where zoning was actually a problem for people trying to think about lessening the city's overall waste stream. And so all of these pieces, each on their own maybe doesn't solve a huge problem, but was in total, when you could kind of think about all the ways the zoning was getting in the way of these things, it began to be clear to us as a department that the zoning, that there was enough here to try to take on and change. This was also work that I should say is not just something done by the Department of City Planning and not just done over the last few years. The first time the zoning really began to engage with issues of sustainability was more than a decade ago in 2012 with the Zone Green text amendment. And really since then, a lot of work on the city, federal, state, and really international side, thinking about the city's role and place within climate change, leading us to be able to identify those areas. It wasn't just us combing through it, but really learning from a lot of other practitioners and others on what were the issues that they were facing in the ZR today. So in total, there were 17 individual topics. When we'd be talking about this publicly, we'd often go through each and every one. But I think now that it's approved, we've been doing it a little differently. We actually gave a similar presentation at the Department of Buildings to plan examiners. And rather than go through those 18 individual, try to think about it from a zoning perspective, use, bulk, and process, like things that require more than just as of right approval at DOB. So we'll take each of those separately. There's a lot here. Some of it may be interesting, some of it may be not sort of typical work that any of us at all do. But in total, we were finding these were things that were worth addressing. So probably the biggest, or one of the bigger ones, was if you were trying to build a solar farm, and that could not just be on a green field in, say, Staten Island, but even on the roof of a building, or if you were trying to do energy storage beyond what would be approvable as accessory. The zoning sort of broke down. The zoning didn't ever really contemplate that scale of use There weren't terms for those kinds of things. It wasn't clear how they would be located, in what uses would they even be. People who were trying to do those things often were finding themselves stuck trying to build electric utility substations and going to the BSA for approval. And it was really identified that, like, if this was the way that the zoning was treating this as a sort of framework, we really were going to have trouble actually building the energy infrastructure the city needed. So what the proposal does, and now does, is it created essentially a new use, and that use was energy infrastructure equipment that was inclusive of all energy generation and also energy storage. So that could be batteries, it could be solar panels, it could be wind turbines, really trying to think of that as a use in the zoning that was beyond an accessory use. And it's allowed for the first time as of right in residence districts, which is like 70% of the city, up to 10,000 square feet. So that's sort of fully permitted as of right. And then in commercial and then beyond that, manufacturing districts would also be permitted beyond 10,000 square feet, whereas typically before that, commercial had been limited to like the 10K. Lots of fun charts. But the real idea is that, like, bumped everything up a notch from where it had been previously. And what we thought that did is it gave people the ability to finally start constructing these things where people were stuck at the BSA or trying to figure out how to make this work economically. The zoning should be getting out of the way of this because the city is really trying to support this as sort of the energy system of the city moving forward. It also does a little bit of stuff to make sure you can do this, that it counts or doesn't count as mechanical space, that it can be located on roofs, all of the kinds of things that often were getting in the way beyond just the use itself. Next, EV charging. So if you were building a facility for charging, not just like a little electric cord in a parking garage, but really like building essentially an electric gas station. Zoning actually knows that use. It actually existed since 2012, but it wasn't allowed in mostly half of the commercial and manufacturing districts in the city. So the proposal, what it did is it just made sure that all commercial and manufacturing districts are allowed to use this use. Oh, really? All right, let me see if I can do this. How do I check? Does this work? Oh, yeah. You could have raised your hands and just told me it was not loud. I can't hear. Okay, so EV charging now allowed in any commercial and manufacturing district, fully as of right. Additionally, there were a number of rules that in parking facilities themselves, where zoning would say things like, well, you could fuel a vehicle in some parking facilities, or it would allow things like car share up to certain percentages. But there really wasn't very much clarity as to what happened if you were trying to do electric chargers in a parking facility. And so the proposal tried to take this on and make some rules for this. The first thing it really does is it just says outright, yes, you can have electric chargers in parking facilities. You don't have to like debate it. It finally was it was sort of so confusing whether that was true or not. This just tries to lay out that was possible. The other thing it tries to do, and this really was coming from places where typically you aren't often allowed public parking, like say in residence districts, that people couldn't let other vehicles, besides maybe the accessory vehicles of the development, onto the lot to actually use that charger. And so what the proposal did was allowed different percentages in different zoning districts, but allowed percentages of all the parking spaces to actually be used for electric charging. And so ostensibly allows non-residents of a building to actually be able to go in and hook up for whatever amount of time charging takes, depending on the type of charger you're using. In addition to that, in having to clean that up, and this was another area we're trying to like do more and try to clean up the zoning itself, there are other rules that allowed commercial vehicles or allowed car share. It was unclear whether commercial vehicles could be stored in parking facilities. those often may need to stay overnight to charge. And so what the proposal also did was just make sure that a sort of overall framework of when space, how many spaces in a parking facility can be used for all these things, and try to make them make sense based on the zoning. And so in commercial districts and manufacturing districts, you have a lot of flexibility, whereas in residence districts, you have less. Another thing that, back in 1961, when at least the core of our parking regs were written, automated parking was not a thing. And so over time, as that has become more and more real, the zoning has kind of tried to recognize that, but only really in some geographies, not citywide. And so particularly here in Manhattan, you had the ability and clarity that you could do automated parking, but if you were trying to do that in Queens or Brooklyn, you'd often get questions as to whether that was permitted or not. And so the proposal makes clear, yes, you can do automated parking. And also, one of the other things that it tries to do is typically parking, you are required to reserve a certain amount of space per spot. So typically it's 300 square feet. You can drop that if you're doing attended parking to 2. But automated parking is smaller. It doesn't need that much space. And so this made clear that the rules that applied in Manhattan core about smaller amounts of space per vehicle, those were also instituted citywide. Also on sort of moving away from auto vehicles, while the zoning goes into extreme detail about public parking, accessory vehicle parking, it has rules for accessory bike parking. There really wasn't clarity as to whether you could do public bike parking. And there were people in different parts of the city who were actually trying to do that and just finding that the zoning sort of broke down at a certain point and never really thought about this. And so what this tried to do is make clear that there is a use that is public bicycle and micromobility parking, and make sure that that is allowed in all of the commercial and manufacturing districts that we have in the city. It allows that use to locate and tries to get the zoning, again, out of the way of it. And then finally, for use, the only waste-related use in the zoning was dump, and the way that the waste stream has sort of evolved over time. We have recycling facilities, we have small-scale composting, none of which was at all clear in the zoning. And so even the Parks Department, when they were trying to build compost facilities, they were getting them forced to be located in M districts or having to be classified as dumps. And so the proposal went through and tried to make some clear distinctions about recycling centers, composting, and where those things were allowed as primary uses, but also as accessory uses too. So that was use, bulk. I'll go through some of the core ones, but this is one of those areas where I think we tried to take what was one of those sort of nightmare sections of the zoning, which were all of the permitted obstructions, which if you've ever looked, none of them matched. So if you were in a res district, they were different than in a C district and not the same in a low density res district. And that was kind of a nightmare. It was just over time, people put things in the resolution and forgot there were other places for it. And so what we did was we actually tried to finally clean this up and make a single framework to kind of bring all of these different rules into alignment, and also just sort of easier to understand. But in doing that, that was the nice thing I think we thought about doing. But we were also doing a lot of the other kind of key things more related to the proposal. Probably the key one here was solar panels. So over time, as you sort of go to other cities, you go to other parts of the region, you see a lot of solar panels on the roofs. You see that sometimes here. It's definitely happened. But there were things that people were pointing out to us as they were trying to put solar panels on their roofs that the zoning was really messing up and really making it harder than I think anyone really assumed would be. There were issues with getting clearance so that FDNY could actually access the roof on some shorter buildings. That's a requirement. There were concerns about actually how do you get this constructability to work actually as construction, because you would often have to set them back from the roof itself. And there were also just dimensional standards that were just sort of out of whack. If you were in a low-density district, you were assumed to have solar panels sort of right around here, not higher up like higher density districts. And so what the proposal did is really try to take the higher density rules that we had and make sure that they were fully permittable on roofs, both in new construction, but also in existing buildings. There were lots of situations where like non-compliance would not allow you to actually put a solar panel on a roof. And we tried to address those things to make sure that you were just never, that solar panels were always going to be permitted on a roof. We knew there were going to be other rules that would preclude it or modify where they would locate, but this would just make clear that the zoning was not the thing that was going to stop you. We also addressed some issues in what we tend to call our pitch roof districts. You were allowed solar panels, but they can only be 18 inches above the roof, which is great if you're doing it exactly at the same angle as the roof. But if you want to do something that's a little bit more pitched, which we were starting to see in other places, the zoning didn't assume that was possible. And so we actually had to adjust those so that you had the ability to do something higher and actually angle these more optimally, depending on the roof situation, depending on where you were and where the sun angle was. We also had to address things where parking spaces, it had never, I think at least to us, been clear whether you could get solar panels above parking facilities, right? Parking is a permitted obstruction, solar panels were a permitted obstruction, but could you put those things together and how did that work? This just tried to make abundantly clear that like you could always do canopies, solar canopies or solar awnings on all parking, and that could be done in any parking facility. The idea being that may make it a little bit easier for someone to try to do this. This one's actually in Queens, but this can now actually happen anywhere. Mechanical space on roofs. One of the things that I think we've learned over time is people retrofit buildings or even are constructing new buildings. They're often finding that they need more and more mechanical equipment to operate their building, to sort of bring it into energy compliance. They're trying to get things like boilers out of basements, and they're going on roofs. And the sort of permitted obstructions for roofs that we have in the city really sort of assume an elevator bulkhead, maybe some additional stuff around that, but weren't really designed with the kind of scale of stuff that people were needing to place on their roofs when they're retrofitting. And so what we essentially tried to do is take rules that we had done a couple of years ago in the floodplain and bring them citywide and make sure that you were always given the ability to sort of fit the mechanical stuff that a building would need today in the city. Generally, depending on the size of it, you can fill more of the roof with lower scaled equipment, but as you have the ability to do some taller equipment, but just has to take up a smaller percentage of the roof. And try to do that consistently across all of the, let's call them flat roof districts that we have, and flat buildings that we have, like community facilities or even low density residential, where typically the rules didn't sort of assume how that would work very well. We also did a thing that zoning previously required any mechanical space as a permitted obstruction to be screened. Given the scale of what we were proposing as mechanical equipment, what we decided to do was require screening of any mechanical equipment, regardless of whether it was a permitted obstruction. So this is a building in a district that allows for taller buildings, and the idea was similarly that mechanical equipment should be screened just like if it was at the top of the building, trying to sort of make the mechanical equipment that people were raising concerns about would be screened to the best degree possible. We also tried to address really two situations. If you're retrofitting a building, you all know, a wall counts as floor area. And when trying to make a building more energy efficient, one of the easier ways to do that and to sort of retrofit a building is to put a thicker wall on it. And the moment you do that, you could be automatically out of compliance because you no longer are, you are building more FAR than you may have been permitted. This was a problem, this was a very real world problem keeping people from actually retrofitting. And so what the proposal did is it created this term, qualifying exterior wall thickness, and it essentially allowed, if you were doing a retrofit of an existing building, you could deduct up to 12 inches of wall thickness, including all the sort of cavities and all the like sort of space that you would need in that overall cavity, to deduct it from floor area. So essentially you could be held more harmless by the zoning and actually undertake this work. We also tried to look at not just existing buildings doing retrofits, but to try to think about buildings that, as a starting point, were new buildings. Oh, sorry.
What about the building that's overbuilt?
Well, that's the point. That like,
Even if you track 12 inches all the way around the building is still overbuilt.
that, right, but if you're able to exempt those additional inches, you're not increasing the degree of non-compliance. That was the idea, that like it would give people the path to doing the thing they were stuck at that moment.
Projection beyond, are you able to project beyond the current allowable projection for providing this type of installation?
Yeah, I think what we were able to do, you know, zoning can sort of do what zoning can do. So we allowed that, I'll call it projection, into the required zoning spaces, yards.
How about the street line?
Streets, unfortunately, are not zoning. And so that was something that we heard a lot during review, which was, can the zoning sort of step into DOT's role and allow people to go off, sort of outboard of the street line? And essentially the zoning just can't do that. And so that's a thing that I think we've taken back as a city, like, just to use this example, if we're going to try to encourage people to do this, the process of doing it at the street line does have to be made easier. But it was just a thing where like we ourselves in the zoning resolution could not do.
So you have to interact now with highways to be able to get that.
Right, and you had to previous. But that was just as a thing that like, we tried to deal with the spaces that zoning could address, and make sure that the zoning worked for those. Think about that. You can use this for the existing building, and then sort of essentially the part I'll get to next, I think for the, let's call it enlargement, which is trying to like, and also I think it's worth saying the next part I'll be talking about also gets to existing buildings also. It has a path for both the existing buildings and the city and proposed.
If you have a question, raise your hand. Wait a minute, though. Allow Councilor to get you a microphone so we can all hear the question, then ask your question.
Sorry. I don't want to get in trouble.
So if I remember correctly, in the building code, is zoning going to talk to the building code? Because right now in the building code, you're only allowed to go 4 inches beyond the street line where many of our buildings are on the property line. Yeah, beyond this.
Right, so
So-
sort of similar answer, which is the zoning tries to do all the things the zoning can do, right? So all those spaces like a yard, a court, a setback area, those were areas where zoning required you to do those things. They're in the sort of essentially the zoning lot. We tried to address all of those. Once we got past the zoning lot, right, we're in the public street, the zoning can't reach in and force anything.
So my question is zoning talking to the building department, the building code, to address this?
Yeah, I think that was what I was saying. That like one of the things we tried to solve all the things we could, and I think you all are not the first people to be like, well, that's cool, but there's a lot of front street, many of the buildings in the city are on the street line. What is that process like? And I think that's something that I don't think we have an answer yet, but it's definitely something that we know, to make all this work. It's sort of what I was saying in the beginning. It's like the zoning can do like little pieces of this, but there's a lot of other things that also have to change. Oh. There were some questions down here.
Okay, thank you. I actually have a question about the solar canopies over the parking that
Yeah.
you were showing. The idea is that they can sell that energy or electricity to other people in the neighborhood? What is the purpose of that?
It could be, I think one of the things we learned is you may be using it on your own property sometimes during the day. You may be putting it back into the grid some other times of the day. And we tried to make sure that the zoning wasn't going to determine which was the right. It was more complicated than accessory in a way because it was like so clear that these things were like moving back and forth. If the temperature was high, if the sun was high, if there was a cloudy day, you would maybe be in all sorts of different situations, and that's just too complicated for zoning to try to take on.
How tall can the knee wall be in order to qualify as a deduction in that image that you're showing?
How tall?
How tall can the knee wall, should the knee wall be in the facade? Can it be on the floor level, or should it be, where do I cut to see that 11 inches of the facade? At what height do I cut?
I feel like that's like one of the philosophical questions of zoning, right? I think we did not try to wade into that debate.
Because that's quite important. I mean, if there is an old facade and it's replaced by a curtain wall that goes floor to floor, that's still better performing than the previous facade, but would that qualify as a deduction or not?
Well, I think what this was trying to do was always sort of allow that. I think the question of where you measure it from is sort of always, I feel.
So even if the curtain wall thickness itself would be less than 11 inches, but at the floor level we would have 11 inches, then that would qualify as a deduction?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's what that sounds the way we think about it, I think.
Okay. Thank you.
You okay if I keep going? All right, good. All right, the other thing that we were trying to do, there was back in 2012, we had created something called it was the Zone Green Tax Amendment, and we called it the Zone Green Bonus or exemption. And what it allowed you to do was you could deduct floor area from a wall, very similar, if the building or that portion of the building's walls exceeded the energy code. And I think over time, as people have tried to work with those rules, they were finding they were not always the best rules in the world. They focused on certain things, but not other things that are like maybe as important from an energy perspective. They tended to be about really for new buildings. They didn't really have a path to make existing buildings work. And it really just felt like 12 years on, maybe it was a good time to try to take this on a little better. And so what we did was essentially say, rather than trying to, for this one at least, measure each and every wall and try to figure out what exemptions you get and sort of breaking everyone's brains at DOB and elsewhere, if you achieve one of two paths, you would be able to get a floor area deduction. And that was based on essentially when you measured what the original zone green deduction was trying to do, it was about 5%. So if you are an existing building, you exist as of date of enactment, you can get that deduction if you become a fully electrified building. It's trying to nudge people toward meeting some of the city's sort of other climate laws. If you're a new building, which you're sort of essentially required to be electric today, the zoning puts a higher standard on for you. It tries to, it takes this, it creates this term ultra low energy building. And the idea of that is that it tries to align you with like the stretch requirements of the city's energy code. So again, a sort of nudge to doing better than just the zoning sort of regulating you. All right, couple process changes. Some of these may be more interesting. Oh.
Zoning refers to ultra low energy building, but there is no definition. In zoning, there is no definition of ultra low building except that we're going to perform 15% better. But on, you know,
right, it does.
Like, do we need to create, like, is it like the electricity or the whole building? Does this require energy modeling, or is that defined or will be defined?
It tries to be defined by because you're going to have to apply, you're going to have to comply with the energy code, and all of that then sort of lives outside the zoning. I think our sense was like we were sort of plugging the zoning into that and into sort of essentially the stretch code parts of the energy code. And the idea is those get updated over time. There's a path to updating, and so that those can always be a little bit more evergreen than the original zone green deduction was, because it sort of made sense in 2012, and over time it become harder and harder to comply with. So it's trying to like work with the rules, the sort of other city rules that we have that like focus on these things better than zoning can ever do. Couple process things. If you were trying to build a wind turbine, rare, but you can, there was a need to think about paths for doing that. We were finding, this actually is a plan the FDNY had, and at one of their facilities, and like the zoning just didn't have anything for them to even apply for. And so this is just allowing, if you need additional height, you can come to the City Planning Commission and get additional height if you're actually trying to do onshore wind. Paving, this is one of the things that like I think surprised us the more we heard from people. The zoning assumed permeable paving was allowed. And what we were finding was that when people actually were trying to do it, DOB was having trouble understanding how to make that possible, what were the rules actually associated with that. Practitioners were really struggling with it. And so what we tried to do is just make abundantly, or as clear as the zoning we think could be, that yes, you can do permeable paving, and that's all. So there are places where zoning actually gets into surfacing. And so this is typically like parking areas, things like that. It allows this to happen. It doesn't require it, but it at least allows it or tries to make sure that zoning isn't precluding it. Street trees, zoning requires street trees of new developments. There were types of street tree treatments that like DOT was really trying to promote. But the zoning was written at a time when the only street trees were just trees, like an individual tree. And so if you were trying to do a rain garden or some sort of wider bed, you actually couldn't comply with the zoning. And so as a way to try to make that a little bit clearer, we just let DOT determine if people wanted to go down a different path, comply with DOT regs, and you can do it. The zoning shouldn't be stopping you. Crazy fun stuff. If you were doing a rooftop garden, you had to come to the city planning department to get a certification to put that rooftop, like a greenhouse, on top of a building. It was really sort of hard. It just made it that much harder for someone to do anything. And so we just made sure that this could be as of right, that someone, if they wanted to actually put a garden on the rooftop, essentially was permitted as an obstruction, and that you could get those same floor area deductions. So that's all. That's one. We've achieved one. Couple pages. A lot of this is, we've put a lot of material on our own website to try to sort of provide people an understanding of what the rules are. But,
Is this on?
yep.
All right, I have a question.
Okay. Yeah.
Regarding the permeable paving surfaces for parking lots, the building code calls for dustless solid surfaces. So even if the zoning permits it, this is contrary to the building code. How is that going to be resolved?
Well, I think of it, I think of it as like, because, I think if there are situations where the building code is requiring something that the zoning is, or is restricting something that the zoning is saying it's allowed, the building code wins, right? Like, let's say that. But one of the things that I think we were finding was even in places where the zoning, where those weren't issues, the zoning was becoming the impediment because there were things not in the building code that were being restricted. I think the other thing is to change zoning requires essentially a year-long public process. Approval of the city council, approval of the city planning commission. And so I think one of the things that we're also trying to do is if we can change the zoning, maybe that offers a path to try to change other rules that may need to be changed. Because again, like the zoning can't change everything, but at least it could kind of get out of the way as those other things may or may not need to change.
Okay.
Hello. I'm just curious why the allowable, used to be allowed to put mechanical units in the rear yard of a 1 or 2 family house. Now you can't have it projecting more than 18 inches off the back of the building, and units are more than 18 inches thick.
I would take that, I would say it as two separate things. I think what we were finding was you always had the ability to do like stuff in yards, sort of yard permitted obstructions. What you were then bumping into in sort of the instance of something applied to the building, like, I'm just going to call it an air conditioner, but I don't mean it, like the sort of, yeah, thank you, the condenser unit, like the zoning just didn't talk about that. And so what that was trying to do was say that was an additional thing, separate from the sort of typical like front yard, rear yard permitted obstructions that were sort of allowed past the building wall.
But you're saying, so, because I've been told otherwise at the DOB now, that I can't locate an AC unit, condenser unit, whatever you want to call it,
Yeah.
for a 1 or 2 family house in my rear yard.
Just-
That's not projecting from it's just sitting on a concrete pad. They said that's taken out, and it's only permitted to be against the building or hanging off the building and not projecting more than 18 inches. I don't know. If they're wrong, I'd love that.
I think we have to look into it,
Okay,
yeah.
I'll get your name.
I have some projects that already got the approval,
Okay.
and then some of the sections have changed. So some of it is beneficial for them to go back and actually revise and resubmit. would they have to then comply with the entire, all the changes? Let's say, for example, the deduction for the exterior wall. We took the deductions, but if they want to have, let's say, permitted obstruction to be changed to the new one, would they lose the deductions that they had?
I shouldn't, I don't want to try to speak for DOB, but I think generally, I would say that 98% of the things here are more permissive than the previous zoning. So if you were trying to, you were at DOB, you were getting plans filed, and you wanted to change them, this wasn't like a vesting issue because, if anything, you were already able to do the thing you were doing back then, and now essentially you may be able to do more. There was one area where, with the existing building zone, or with the existing zone green deduction, and we tried to write vesting language that gave people the ability to keep going with their plans, because they were all trying to do good things with their building, and we didn't want to force people into this situation where all of a sudden the rules changed on them when they were just following the rules. So we did try to write vesting language that gave people who were at DOB in a very light way the ability to keep going and using that single rule while still being able to take advantage of the others if they wanted to.
Okay, so you're saying that's basically depends on the DOB mainly?
I would say that we did try to address it. I think, I don't know this, but I never like talking about buildings definitively because it's it depends on the building. But I think the idea was that the one arguably more restrictive thing, we tried to write very generous vesting provisions to allow people who were at DOB to keep going with that. And then that one may be more, beyond that one, if people wanted to amend their plans and modify what they were doing, the rest of it was more permissive. And so you didn't really have, people could take advantage of that permissiveness or not, but they weren't going to run into the same issues of finding themselves stuck trying to do something because the rules change right in the middle for them.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. It's something that is true for a lot of the different aspects of these different proposals. It's hard to change zoning to this degree while people are still building buildings or trying to locate uses. And so we've always been trying to be generous with vesting where the zoning is becoming more restrictive to make sure that people are not just put in a rough situation.
How do you define automated parking?
We do define it. Do you remember? I'm trying to, it's basically I would think of it the opposite way, which is that you're always allowed parking. Typically, you're required to have 300 square feet per space, or 200 if it's automated. If you can get to, you are doing automated, you would get the ability to get that deduction. And I think we did write we took the rule from Manhattan Core, the definition as to what automated parking was.
So is it fully automated?
I think the idea is that there's a automated mechanism that is moving the vehicle from the entryway to its parking location. It's not just a stacker or a lift system. It's a machine that is driving the car, a robot.
A robot. All right. If no other questions, can we jump to the next project? Cool. All right.
One more question.
Sorry.
Related to the things you were just talking about, and what this gentleman was speaking about, the mechanical equipment.
Okay.
So in the zoning, because I've had to do a number of these, where you can have the 18 inches projection into a required side yard. But if you set back, if your side yard was a little bit greater than the minimum side yard, you have to hold 5 feet from the property line to the piece of mechanical equipment. So there's a whole calculation that's involved in zoning that's currently now with regard to get the permission of using that equipment without screening is one component, but it's mainly to set back the equipment 5 feet from a side yard. And that's where I think if he investigated, you would see that that's not the case. It's interesting, however, that the 18 inches happens to coincide with split systems, the split systems. However, the split system is actually 16 inches wide, requires about 4 to 6 inches long. So the 18 inches is rather arbitrary. It doesn't really take into account the actual system. Second thing is on the permeable paving. I have a few city planning applications that are currently being reviewed where I try to show permeable paving for off-site parking. Indicated by the city planning that though they understand that it may percolate water, it's still considered an impervious surface. So what you're proposing is directly contrary to where your city planners are viewing it for applications, because they're looking for a maximum of, let's say, a certain percentage of the lot to be impervious. That information going to be conveyed to the planners in all the boroughs?
Yes. I would say, like, we should talk after. It'd be great to just understand where the projects are. The way it's a big city with a lot of different people, and as you can tell, even for what we tend to think of as the smallest of these projects, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of it. It'd be helpful to like know where it is, and we could try to figure out what the issue is. Okay? All right. I get to pause.
Okay, so I'll talk about our second City of Yes project, City of Yes for Economic Opportunity. And the root of this is just, it's pretty probably apparent to you all. The zoning was oftentimes really obsolete and getting in the way of business expansion. And it's something we would often joke about, in zoning, but I'm sure you all kind of are aware of it as well, that in many ways, the use regulations of the zoning resolution prior to zoning for economic opportunity were some of the most woefully obsolete parts of the zoning code. You could find, up until this year, you could find shoddy manufacturing in the zoning. You could find typewriter repair shops, phonograph shops, but you couldn't find cell phone repair. You couldn't even find any mention of a computer store. And let alone, all the technological lapses in between, cassette stores, CD stores, and everything in between. So this is something that, while we joke about it, it actually had very real implications for many business owners. If you were trying to start a business, you probably did not have the money to seek legal counsel to find out what your use classification would be. And that left you with a choice. Do you operate illegally and risk, being in a zoning violation, or do you just kind of spend the money? And that's oftentimes not great for a starting or emerging business. So what we wanted to do was just try to eliminate some of those barriers, even if it is mundane as use reform. So like carbon neutrality, we broke our project into 4 different goals. Goal number 1 was to make it easier for businesses to grow, find their space and grow. 2 was to target certain sectors within the city and boost those growing industries. 3 was to enable more business-friendly streetscapes. We didn't want to lose sight of the bigger picture. We were introducing a lot of new uses into neighborhoods. We wanted to make sure that they were compatible and interactive with the streetscape. And then 4, to create new opportunities for businesses to open. We had 18 different proposals within each of these categories, and I will walk you through these proposals in a different manner. The first one that I'm going to dive into is understanding our new use groups and use framework. It's not really core to our proposal, but it's probably very core to the way you interact with the zoning resolution. So I want to spend some time on that and noting the major shifts there. The second one is to talk about some of the policy shifts that will allow for a lot of new flexibility for certain uses throughout the city. I'll talk about streetscape regulations next, and then go into new rules for location of use and building interiors, and then briefly talk about some new discretionary actions and some new zoning districts. Okay, so part one, new use groups and lists of uses. So as I was mentioning, one of the features of the 1961 resolution was 18 different use groups. And to the layperson, they might think about a group of uses as being, uses that are the same, like retail. But that's actually not the way that the zoning resolution thought of uses. They thought of groups of uses that were compatible within a certain zoning district. So any given use group had myriad different uses within it. Some of them might have been retail, some of them might have been entertainment, some of them might have been services. And there was a really hard way to grapple with that. What we try to do is just break that apart a little bit and create 10 different use groups, and each of them being sort of sector specific. So use group 1 would be agricultural open use group 2 residences, use group 3 community facilities, use group 4 public service facilities and infrastructure, 5 transit accommodations, 6 retail and services, 7 offices and other workspaces, 8 recreation, entertainment and place of assembly, 9 storage, 10 production. What we tried to do is keep some of the most common uses, prevalent uses in the same number, just to make that easier to grapple with. So, multifamily residences staying use group 2, retail is staying use group 6, entertainment is staying use group 8, but a lot of the other ones, transient hotels are staying use group 5, but some of the other ones are moving around a little bit. But what we thought the benefit of having 10 discrete use groups and being very clear about that was a big benefit. So this is kind of the old use group framework, and you can see there was 18 different use groups, and really the heart of the matter was right in here where, depending on your district, you had 10 different use groups available to you or 2. Our new framework tries to take all of that and synthesize it. It is pretty complicated. So there's a lot of time for us trying to navigate this. It's clear now, right? The way that you'll kind of be introduced to this on the online ZR is now what we're doing is, instead of listing the districts at the top and you trying to figure out if the use is allowed in the district or not through the top and through the use groups, we're trying to create a table that says really clearly every single zoning district and whether the use is allowed. So you'll see first of all, a dot. If it's a black dot, it's allowed in the district. If it's a hash mark, it's not allowed. And if it's a white circle, it's allowed by discretionary action. Below the dot, sometimes you'll see an S, a P, or a U. Those have 3 different meanings. So if you see an S, it means that there's a size restriction associated with it. If you see a P, it means there's some condition upon allowing the use. So that could be a geographic restriction, it could be, an environmental restriction. And if you see a U, it means it's allowed to be unenclosed. So when you start to apply that to the table, you'll see for any given use, you'll see the list of districts, if this is allowed as of right, if it's not allowed, if it's allowed without any restrictions, so this is a size restriction and a condition. This has no restrictions on it, so you're just allowed to do it in C4 through C7. The C8, that would be designating it's by discretionary action, and then we've put the parking requirement category as a last column. So just playing this out in some of our use group 6, you'll see that we have a sort of orange header and then all of the sub-uses associated with that. For 2 different sectors, for our retail sector and for our manufacturing or production sector, we tried to peg them to the North American Industrial Classification Codes. And you'll see that in the numbers right here. And the reason for doing that is to try to be a little bit more evergreen. We learned from the mistakes of just trying to put uses in and not giving any path for them to evolve over time. So we tried to peg them to the NAICS sector. In order to make that a little more friendly, in case there's any ambiguity, you can go to the bigger tables and find out if you think that that use is actually that use. That is our intention. And for those of you that aren't familiar with this is the North American Industrial Classification System. It's just a way that businesses categorize themselves into different categories. And it makes the most sense. We try to do it beyond just these two sectors. It really makes the most sense in retail, service, and manufacturing. Those are the two closest crossovers. But the way that it works, it has a 2-digit category, a 3-digit category, a 4-digit category, and then it gets really, really granular. We tried to stay at this level because once you go down here, it becomes really, really niche. So we tried to hover around this 3-4-digit level. But this has changed every 5 years, so our hope is that by pegging it to these categories, if there's future uses created, they'll probably slot into one of these categories. So that it will help DOB kind of have a sense of where we intend that to be located in the future. So here's an example. If you wanted to build an automobile dealer, this is where you would find it in the NAICS code, and it gives you a really helpful description of what that use is, and that hopefully that gives more predictability to people that are trying to interact with our zoning code. We've also, I was joking before when I had the crossover table, but we actually did take the time to try to take our old use groups and apply them to our new use groups and make a crossover. And this is actually a PDF we have on our website. So it has every 1,000 different use that we previously had and that we currently have. So this is a resource that's available to folks. DOB knows about it as well. And one final note about this is that you'll notice that we shifted from numbers to Roman numerals. This is something that we actually talked with DOB a lot about, and they thought it was best to do this so that there could be, if you're updating a building and you're trying to work with it, you're updating your C of O, there would be actually a line in the sand that showed, this is your building C of O before ZO, and this is your building C of O after ZO. So it would be very clear to them and to everyone trying to work with this building what was a prior designation versus a future designation or a present designation. So we try to not overthink it, but visually there will be a distinct line in that sand so you can see it. Here's a few more examples of use translation. We did it both ways. So if you wanted to start with the old use and go forward, what would that new use group be? And then also backwards. Another caveat that probably people like yourselves had to grapple with a lot was, if there was no category for a use before, like a tattoo parlor, there was no use categorization for that. You had to rely on interpretation and hope that, DOB would slot it in somewhere. A lot of these categories have sort of catch-alls at the end of them that are all other personal care services. And tattoo parlors is a good example in this, in that they would be categorized under this catch-all. So there are a lot of kind of fringe cases that now have a home in our table. Another example, and there's quite a few uses like this in the zoning resolution, that it could be one categorization and it could be another categorization. So bakery, it could be a retail, it could be a production. So you'll find this in actually two different use groups today, or in the future, today and in the future. If you're going to be a food retailer, you'd be use group 6. And if you're going to be a production use, where you're actually, the baking of your goods is the predominant use, then you would actually be food manufacturing. You'll see that this is a little bit of a foreshadowing, but that is allowed in C1 and C2 districts going forward. So that would be, with the size limitation. So that's a pathway and more options for more people. So that's a good segue to new use flexibility. So one of the first things that we try to do is look at our districts themselves. And one of the big things that the department has kind of been looking at, researching over time, is are all those persnickety distinctions between commercial districts, is that all necessary? Is that the reality of the city that we live in? Or are they sort of a little bit woefully obsolete? Are they a vestige of the 60s and maybe even the 50s, 40s? And so what we tried to do was look at our local retail districts, our C1 and our C2 districts, and look at our regional districts, our C4, C5, and C6, and actually evaluate are the perceptions that the zoning makes between them, are they real? Is there really all that much difference between a C1 and a C2 district? Because if you're walking down the street, you probably don't perceive it. But the way that these districts are mapped across the city, this is a very real thing where one side of the street could be C1, the other side could be C2. The walker by may not realize this, but the business person this has implications for them. If you want to be a bike seller, you could locate in the C1 district, but if you wanted to do repairs, you can't locate in the C1 district. You'd have to move to the C2 district. And that's kind of crazy. So we looked at these districts and we found that actually there is not a whole lot of difference between C1s and C2 districts. And there was not that much difference between C4, C5, and C6. So we tried to take it upon ourselves to equalize all of the uses that were allowed in each of those districts. So C1 and C2 districts, all the uses that were allowed in the C2s, we would allow in the C1s. All the uses that were allowed in the C6s, we'd bring down to the C5s and the C4s. So that's what we proposed. And that's largely what got adopted. There are some caveats to that. So certain to start in the low density, because that's where the majority of the changes occurred. There are still certain uses that are excluded from the C1 districts. So automobile and other motor vehicle dealers, automotive service stations and boat fuel sales, and then retail lumber stores. Those are excluded from being located in C1 districts. So that's not a huge loss. And then there are some uses that are going to be, they'll be allowed in the C1 districts, but they'll be size limited to 3,000 square feet. So these newly introduced uses, retail and leasing services, computer infrastructure providers, special food services, and then some retail and maintenance service uses, they would be limited to 3,000 square feet. So not a huge loss. The larger gain of having all of these uses be allowed and introduced is kind of great and changes the whole dynamic of these areas of the city. So just to give you a lay of the land, the C1 districts are in blue here, and then the C2 are in red. So now these would all be equalized. And you can see that there's a lot of these places that they do really go one to the other in a pretty arbitrary manner. So now it sort of makes sense that they can all have largely the same set of uses allowed throughout them. And then in the C4 through C6 districts, all of the uses, this survived unscathed. All of the same uses are permitted throughout. So that's a tremendous change. You'll see this is also says C7. We sort of rebranded C7. C7 is an amusement entertainment district. That's why you'll see it in Coney Island. We took it back and made it a new district that allows all of the same uses that C6 does as well, except for residential. So that's why you see it on this table here. Okay, so that was probably the largest part of this new use flexibility. The next few are smaller, but they're also meaningful changes. Previously, there was a restriction in C4, C5, and then some special purpose districts that restricted certain uses from being located on the ground floor. We removed that prohibition and said that any use that's permitted in the district is allowed now on the ground floor, subject to streetscape regulations. So that's one impediment that we removed. I started to allude to this before. So one thing that we wanted to do was expand the opportunities for small-scale clean production. And this is allowing artisanal manufacturing into our commercial districts. So we wanted to allow more things than just bakeries. We wanted to allow things like apparel manufacturing, 3D printing, jewelry making, things that are perfectly compatible with our commercial corridors. They had no path to be located in our commercial districts prior to this. We didn't want to, open up full-scale manufacturing facilities. They should stay small, but if you're going to be small and clean, they're perfectly compatible with a commercial district. So what we allowed was up to 3,000 square feet in the C11 to C14 district. In C2 districts and other C1s, up to 5,000 square feet. And then in C4 through C7 districts, you can do these limited to 10,000 square feet on the ground floor, and then without a limitation above. The caveat to that is that there are performance standards that will apply, and then if you're going to locate these in a building with residences, there's other standards that will apply, just to ensure that you're a good neighbor and that you're compatible with the building. So in terms of those standards, we borrowed from the MX districts. We borrowed down and said that you would have to meet the ABC rules there and the right to know rules. So those will be in place. You will be subject to performance standards, the M1 performance standards, so those will apply. And then if you are going to be in a building with residences, there's additional standards that apply regulating air quality, vibration, and that sort of thing. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. The next thing that we did, this was a quirk of the 1961 resolution, and it really was a product of its time. Previously, zoning required that, unlike parking, where you sort of provide the parking spaces as you develop or enlarge a building, the zoning previously said that when you're changing your use or converting your use, if your loading requirements changed, you had to change your loading. So if you changed from one use that had a lax loading requirement and changed to a use that had a more onerous loading requirement, you were expected to actually cut out and build up a loading berth within your building. And obviously that's really hard to do and not conducive to a lot of the things that you might expect in a place like a manufacturing district. If you wanted to encourage manufacturing uses, requiring a building owner to actually cut out part of the building to provide loading berths is not a great way to get those manufacturing uses. So what we did was we equalized these rules with the parking rules and said that now going forward, you're only required to provide loading when you're doing your development or doing your enlargement. You wouldn't have to provide loading for a change of use anymore. That's just showing the strikeout of that change. Just fulfilling. Another thing that we did, just so you're aware of it when you're kind of combing through the regulations, we tried to adapt some of our, not change the rules so much as change the way that they're portrayed in the zoning resolution, and this pertains to the parking and loading requirements. So parking requirement categories existed, obviously, prior to ZEO, but they were based on different parking utilization metrics, and so they ranged from A to, I believe, G, or H. H was a special category. And they sort of had an internal coherence to themselves, but that wasn't readily apparent to people that were trying to use the zoning resolution. So what we did was just reorganize them. We reorganized the parking requirement categories on an A to G, but just tried to bunch them by the way that they measured the requirement. So anything that measured a requirement based on square foot of floor area, we put in one category. Another one that was, if you were based on a person-rated capacity, a lot of the entertainment uses rate their parking that way, so that we put those all together into a B. If you were an open use and you based your requirement on lot area, then we put those all together and put them in C. If you were sort of a lot of the manufacturing uses, they were either square foot of floor area or number of employees. So we made those all a different category and put those in D, and so on and so forth. So it's just a reorganization of them. We didn't change the actual rates of them. So then we reorganized them into the table and just grouped all the districts on the left, put their requirements at the top, and then you'll find the same requirements as you had previously, just reorganized differently in the table. So hopefully it's a little more user-friendly, a little more transparent about how they're organized. And this is novel, but we did the same thing with loading categories. We tried to break everything into different loading categories based on what they had today. So all prior to ZEO. So any use that was listed under, these are the storage or manufacturing uses, we put them in a loading requirement category A, and so on and so forth. So A, B, C, D, and E. And it just helped us be able to actually arrange them and put them all together in a way that's hopefully more user-friendly. And that also helped us actually put into a table all the different, that we brought that into the minimum size of loading berths as well. Okay, another thing that we did was this built on a memo that DOB had issued about 2 years ago that was trying to grapple with the emergence of micro distribution centers in Manhattan. And they were having a tough time categorizing them. So they issued a memo that said, depending upon whether they allowed people into the store, they would be use group 6 or use group 7 and under the previous categories. But there was, until we created one, no actual use category for that. So we created one, and we called it a micro distribution facility. We put that in the storage use category, so that's use group 9. And now they're allowed, as of right, clearly, in all commercial districts. If you're in a C1 and C2 district in Manhattan, it would be up to 2,500 square feet. And if you're in a C4 through C7, it'd be 5,000 on the ground floor and then 10,000 square feet above. There's some caveats to that. It's not permitted outside Manhattan in C1 and C2 districts. And then, we weren't trying to touch the ability to do larger warehouses outside of these commercial districts. So you're still allowed to do a warehouse in a C8 district or manufacturing districts. And here's it in the use table, and you can see it's got the S, so it has size restrictions. And this isn't actually a dot, this is a diamond. And the diamond signifies that it has mixed applicability. In some districts, it's allowed as of right. In some districts, it's not allowed at all. So that's it's one of the rare instances where we have a diamond applied. Another thing that we did was clarify the rules to permit urban agriculture. And then specifically, it's indoor urban agriculture. So agriculture's always been allowed as part of, in every zoning district. The problem was it was only allowed to be open. And so as we've gotten to hydroponics, and that's become a thing within the city, it hasn't been clear that whether you're allowed to do that indoors or not. And so we wanted to proactively make sure that this was allowed to be indoors. So we allowed it as a use group 1 use, and it allowed it to be enclosed. This is besides from being in a greenhouse, this is enclosed within a building, up to 3,000, 10,000 square feet in the C1s and C2s, and then without limitation beyond that. This is maybe more subtle, but certain in this continues, but there are certain uses in the zoning that it may seem to, that it would be obvious that it would need to be unenclosed in order to flourish. But that actually wasn't allowed, and it previously, and this continues largely, that uses have to be enclosed within buildings. But some of the more obvious ones, we wanted to make sure that it was there wasn't a barrier to having these be unenclosed. So here's a couple examples: lawn and garden equipment and florists. If you wanted to put flowers outside your store on the street, that wasn't allowed before. So we've proactively said those can be unenclosed uses. It's probably pretty obvious, and probably people have been doing it since time immemorial, but now they're legally allowed to do it. This is a more important one. This also builds upon a prior DOB memo, and this deals with life sciences. We wanted to really memorialize and codify the memorandum that was issued in 2016 by DOB and some other city agencies, and to make sure it was clear that you could do laboratories in most of our commercial districts. And so we made sure that a new production labs are allowed in C1, C2, C4, C5, C6, C7, C8, and M districts. And we referenced the building code, section 427, to try to really pinpoint what we're trying to allow here. Because the intention isn't to allow hazardous laboratories to operate in areas of the city that have residences. It's really to allow non-production chemical laboratories that are safe and that are not high hazard facilities. We're trying to allow these ones that DOB has deemed to be non-hazardous and compatible with neighborhoods to locate in our commercial districts. Another one is nightlife and entertainment rules. So this is another area of the zoning that was really arcane and actually rooted in classism and racism. Several years ago, the city council removed the cabaret laws, but the zoning actually kept vestiges of them, and some of those that you would see were actual prohibitions on dancing in many of our commercial districts. So what we did was we tried to remove those impediments and actually make the distinction between what you could do in a C1 and C2 district versus other commercial districts be whether, just more practical matters, it's size limitations and whether they were going to have a cover charge, whether the establishment was going to have specified show times, and whether they're going to have a dance floor or not. And if you were going to have those things, but your capacity remained under 200 persons, then you can operate in a C1 and C2 districts. If you're going to have these things and be larger than that, then that's really when you should be locating in a C4, C5, or C6 district, if not, the larger commercial or manufacturing districts. So this is just a graphic showing sort of the ambiguity that existed before ZEO, especially in our C1 and C2 districts. It was ambiguous whether, if you had a little jukebox playing in the corner, if someone wanted to just start dancing to it, were you breaking the zoning law? And so we tried to remove that ambiguity and then actually address the situations where, you were actually, obviously prohibited from doing dancing. And
Quick questions.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Previously in M1 districts, there were as-of rights that allowed for use group 12, for instance, that it was as of right, but in the newer release, I don't see that same as of right allowance anymore. So
it should be there.
Do those exist? Is there like a clear chart somewhere that shows that? Because I've been having finding that.
We'll check just to make sure we didn't, but it should be in 4216. Okay, it's not there? Okay, we'll check into it. That just, obviously with a 1,000-page text amendment, we miss some things and we make mistakes. So it's always helpful to find things. Sometimes we inadvertently left things off, but there was not an actual intention to remove any allowance that previously existed.
I've got a client with a clothing store.
Yeah.
They want to hold events in the backyard to promote the designers. It doesn't really fit into any of those categories because it's not an eating and drinking establishment. But the DOB says I have to give it a use.
You have to give it a use?
I have to give it a use.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions?
It sounds like it would be accessory to the clothing store. The tricky part is that would not be allowed to be unenclosed.
Right, so there is a publicly accessible spaces that is unenclosed. Would it fall into that category?
That's not how we intended it. That we intended that more as a sort of analogous to a plaza or a publicly accessible open space.
That was my assumption too,
Yeah.
but they're telling me I have to give it a use, and I have no idea what to do. And they said, oh, well, do a ZD determination kind of thingy and guess.
Right.
I don't want to guess.
Yeah, we have talked with them about whether, even if the primary use has to be enclosed, sometimes there's allowances for an accessory use to be unenclosed if it's commonly and customarily found to be, unenclosed. That would be sort of up for them to determine if that's the case in this specific scenario.
You're not helping.
I'm sorry.
It's because,
the
the owner has said, oh, we'll just put the store out there, we'll put clothes.
Right.
But that's not typically an unenclosed use. And if you want to have an outside event, with a poetry reading or a, catwalk or something.
They would probably have to make the case that those sorts of events are customarily unenclosed. And if you could make the case that they're customarily found in connection with a small retail establishment, but that's really up for them to determine if that's true or not. But it's up to you. If you want to make the case. Well, yeah, I understand. I mean, what we try to deal with is more like permanent uses, and the temporary use issue is a longstanding problem, and I completely understand. We try very hard to not regulate temporary uses in the zoning because it would just be a nightmare for everyone.
Ready for the next?
Yeah.
I'm all in favor of the mixed uses. I think that's very good. I'd like to understand why hotels are not allowed except through a special permit. To me, it makes no sense. It's a very logical, natural use in a commercial district.
That's a great question. That's not something we were looking to take on with this. I mean, all of you are obviously aware of the political sensitivities of this, and it's not something we were looking to, take on again. That's the honest answer. I mean,
the sensitive person is no longer in the city.
Understood. There's the group that represented the hotel industry is still powerful, and they're still in the city. So we're not looking to take that on right now.
Eating and drinking is clear. So I think we got a question about eating and drinking establishments in M districts. So if you go to the use groups in the M districts, so which is Article 4, Chapter 2, they similarly have versions for each of those use groups Chris went through. And eating and drinking establishments are in use group 6 and are shown as permitted in all three, M1, M2, M3.
Okay, another use allowance that we were trying to introduce, and this is something that was, kind of strange in the 1961 resolution, in that it was really harsh against entertainment. And this is one of the areas of the zoning that was really classist in that, certain commercial districts just didn't even allow things like, billiard parlors or pool establishments. They were, probably associated with working class type folks and not compatible with C5 districts. So what we wanted to do was really open this up, allow for small scale entertainment in many of our commercial districts, and then in the C4, C5, C6, allow them, much more broadly without square footage limitations. So not only does that open it up, but also kind of gives some clarity into, a lot of novel entertainment type uses that you're seeing in the city. That's we think is kind of exciting and great. It's good to have, locations for things like laser tag and, virtual reality areas, and not just limit entertainment to like 5 different 1960s uses. One of the areas where we were probably a little more restrictive, one of the few areas than the existing zoning resolution, was in auto repair shops. Previously, there were sort of 2 different categories of auto repair. One was a use group 16 use that was allowed in C8 districts and M districts. And then there was a sort of lighter scale auto repair that allowed for tire repair, glass repair, and installation. And that was allowed in use group 7, so that meant that it could be in C2 districts, C6 districts. What we did in the proposal was say actually all of them should be removed from as of right applicability in our commercial districts. That were not C8 districts, and we gave access for the light motor vehicle repair to have a BSA special permit to operate in a C1 district, a C2 district, a C4 through C7 district. So that's a little bit of a change. We made it a little bit more restrictive, but we actually think that that's a good thing in the whole, because it just they aren't necessarily great neighbors in a pedestrian area of the city. So since these districts allow so many different uses that are actually trying to bring people onto the streets, we wouldn't want to have these sort of potentially incompatible uses with them as of right. Okay, so that was the use flexibility. Next part pertains to streetscape rules. A lot of this area of the proposal tried to grapple with a really incoherent and unpredictable, realm of the zoning prior to ZEO. A lot of our streetscape regulations, we liked them. They were good regulations. The problem was they were created piecemeal, and they were created over time, and they were created in different geographies, and they had different levels of applicability. Sometimes they were attached to special districts, sometimes they were attached to zoning districts, sometimes they were attached to building typologies, and sometimes they were attached to, a qualifying ground floor of a quality housing building. So there was really no rhyme or reason and no coherence to them. So what we tried to do was really just make a framework and try to make a really predictable framework that people that are in the building industry could kind of look at a map and understand whether it's going to apply, and just kind of know that every building on this corridor was probably going to have the same rule. The other reason that we wanted to focus on this is that when we're trying to loosen up so many different rules and allow so many new uses in our corridors, we wanted to make sure that there was actually a safeguard that at the pedestrian level, as you're interacting with these buildings, you could reasonably be assured that if you're going to newly allow a manufacturing use on there, it wasn't going to be belching out, noxious things. It was going to have to actually be sort of retail facing, because it was going to have glass, and it was going to have to, be friendly enough to walk by, and that you would actually have to interact with it in some level. It wasn't going to should be a blank wall and divorced from the street. So that was the other reason we wanted to put these rules in place. The way we did this was we tried to, create a system where we divided it into Tier A, Tier B, Tier C. Tier A, we sort of envisioned these as being, the furthest flung areas of the city. We weren't trying to ask too much of these corridors, just sort of the basics, that you put your parking sort of behind the building, to the side of the building, and that if you're going to have a blank wall, that you put some, landscaping in front of it, or put a mural on it, some artwork, something to spruce it up. Nothing crazy, just the, sort of a bare minimum to help the passerby, just make it a more pleasant experience for them. In Tier B, which starts to apply once you're in the transit zone being the geography we created a few years back for, sort of a proxy for transit accessibility. Once you're in Tier B, then we start to layer on some regulations that actually mandate some ground floor activity, some minimum amounts of transparency, parking enclosure, and then if curb cut location, if you're on a wide street and a narrow street, if you're on a corner, we might ask you to shift the curb cut to the side street, things like that. Tier C largely is existing geographies, and these are going to be the places that already have a more onerous set of rules in place. We didn't want to knock them down. We kind of we devised that they came up with their standards, and as part of a plan, we didn't want to ding them down, but we wanted to preserve them and bring them into the framework. So I mentioned the Tier A. These are going to be the furthest flung areas. They would have that prohibition on blank walls, parking to the side. Tier B, this is where you're starting to see these geographies. In our transit accessible areas, we put a active use requirement of about 30 feet, transparency required, max lobby length of 50 feet. Parking has to be wrapped on certain frontages or screened on other frontages. And we make a lot of outs to this. So if you're across from a manufacturing district, you can get out of these rules. If you're next to a highway cut and you can't actually walk across your neighborhood, you get out of these rules. If you're in a commercial corridor where actually you might be mapped as a commercial district, and you may see it on the zoning map, but the reality might not actually be that. You might have a lot of your surrounding areas there's actually dwelling units at grade, and it might look more like a residential street. You can get out of these rules if you show that actually it's not really conducive for me to put retail at grade. You can get out of these rules. So we tried to build in a lot of different safety valves so that it's not too onerous on folks. And then Tier C, these largely coincide with special purpose districts or other geographies where regulations are already in place. They're largely the same requirements as a Tier B. The change I would note is that once you get into the highest density commercial districts, then you start to have a minimum standard of a minimum amount of retail and entertainment that has to be at grade. And that coincides with the existing rules. Okay. Part 4, new rules within buildings. This is a nice rule that we created. So this rule existed prior to ZEO. It is an allowance for a discontinued use to reinstate itself if you're non-conforming. The problem was it was limited to R5 districts, R6 districts, or R7 districts. And so it had no applicability outside of that. It also didn't have applicability if you were in a historic district. So what we did was we took that exact rule, except we just expanded it citywide and said if you're in any R district, including historic districts, and you had a non-conforming use that was discontinued for more than 2 years, you can reinstate that non-conforming use, provided that it's limited to a use group 6, retail or service use, or an office. We also tweaked our home occupancy, our home occupation regulations. So prior to ZEO, there was an allowance for up to 25% of the dwelling unit, not more than 500 square feet, could be allocated to home occupations, and there were also some prohibitions on certain home occupations. What we did was we upped the percentages, we upped the square footages, and tried to remove some of the prohibited uses. So the floor area allowance is now up to 49% of the dwelling unit and not more than 1,000 square feet. And then we removed certain things like interior decorating or stockbrokers' offices or barber shops from the prohibited list and kept in the things that were the most obvious incompatible things like kennels and animal breeders and veterinary visitations. Another thing that we did was give some flexibility in the mixing of uses within buildings. So this pertains to buildings that contain residences and your ability to locate commercial uses within them and where they can go within the building. So prior to ZEO, there were a lot of regulations that prohibited uses from being even on the same floor as residences. Even if you had separate, corridors, separate access throughout the buildings, they couldn't be located on the same floor within a building, let alone be on a higher floor. So what we proposed to do was in C1, C2 districts to allow up to 2 stories to be allocated to non-residential uses and then allowed them to be on the same floor, provided that there's separate access between them. And then once you got to the C4, C5, and C6 districts, we allowed them to be on the same floor or higher than the residences, provided they had separate access. And then for all of these uses, there's some caveats that you would be subject to air quality, vibration, and other performance standards when you are in that mixed building. So this is just to give you a sense of those environmental standards that you're going to encounter. If you're mixing and the use that you're mixing with is a use group 10, so these are our production manufacturing uses, then you're going to be subject to air quality rules. If there's going to be a commercial use that's on the same story or higher than a dwelling unit, then you're going to have to be subject to these noise rules, and you can either fulfill that by being a minimum distance from the residence of at least 15 feet, or provide attenuation, just to make sure that you're not incompatible with that residence. And then you will also be subject to vibration standards. And we're borrowing these vibration standards from the performance standards in an M1 district. And then, last but not least, some discretionary actions and new zoning districts. Okay, so this is a CPC special permit that we created. It was to allow a retail on a large campus, a large residential campus. The issue we were trying to grapple with was that many large-scale campuses, they had no path for actually introducing a small amount of retail onto their campus, aside from proposing a whole new rezoning to map a commercial overlay. We tried to create a sort of easier process for them. We proposed a CPC authorization that got reverted to a CPC special permit in the process, but nonetheless, it's a tool for them. There were a lot of different use, discretionary actions, some at the BSA, some at the CPC, that oftentimes allowed larger uses than you could previously do as of right. We tried to rationalize that a little bit and create sort of a 2-step framework So a lot of our uses that are allowed as of right up to a size limitation, we would propose that they would be allowed to expand through a BSA special permit to effectively double their size. So if you, say, had a 10,000 square foot size limitation for a clothing store in a certain district, then you could go to the BSA to double it up to 20,000 square feet. And if that still wasn't enough for you, then you could go to the CPC and go anything beyond that doubling. So anything beyond 20,000 square feet in this example. So we tried to create this sort of two-step process, not two-step, two-path process, where the BSA would allow up to one size, and then the CPC allows it beyond that size. So that's something that you can kind of look for in 73 versus 74 of the zoning resolution. Another thing we did, most of this has been use related. Now we're going to touch a few different bulk things that we did. The first one was to create a CPC authorization to modify bulk regulations. This is for commercial districts and manufacturing districts. What we were trying to address here is that some of our bulk regulations just aren't really compatible with a lot of our growing sectors. A lot of the examples that we use are sort of film studios. They might want to just rise sheer at the property line to build a big soundstage or just to address their needs. But a lot of our bulk regulations actually have a sky exposure plane that starts right here and would actually pierce through this building wall. So we created a CPC authorization to allow for bulk modifications to address this sort of situation. And then the last thing we did was to create new zoning districts. It's sort of in a similar vein in that a lot of our bulk regulations for a lot of our manufacturing districts use these sky exposure planes, and it's not necessarily conducive if you wanted to build a new building that was loft-like and had a lot of different uses integrated within that building. You wouldn't necessarily have a right zoning tool in terms of an existing district that met your bulk needs. So we tried to create different new zoning districts in sort of a range of typologies to address that. So going from most restrictive to least restrictive, we have our M3A. All of these districts have an A suffix to designate to make them separate from the existing M districts. We call this our core district, and this is where FAR for non-manufacturing uses is a little bit suppressed. In our transition districts, there is actually an FLURI incentive for certain tranches of commercial uses and manufacturing uses. And then in our growth district, they're all equalized. All the non-residential uses are equalized. And our growth districts can be tools that you actually use in an MX district as well. So you can pair the M1A within our district in an MX area as well. Each of them has different purposes and different different calibrations of FAR, but they are the same in that they have a much looser envelope that really tries to create a taller street wall and departs from the sky exposure plane in these areas. The C7, I alluded to this a little bit earlier. This is an existing district that we tried to repurpose. So we're allowing, in addition to permitting all types of uses within all types of non-residential uses here, we also gave it the loft-like envelope. So these are hopefully a new tool that you can use throughout the city. This district also has a range of FARs associated with it, so there's a lot of different options within it. So that's all I have on ZEO. Any more questions on ZEO? Yeah.
Yeah, this is in reference to the home occupation.
Yeah.
So under the new zoning, you basically just blew it out of the water, going to up to 1,000 square feet of an apartment or home being used for commercial purposes, essentially, and practically no limitation on the number of employees that person can have in the apartment.
There's a number.
It used to be, I believe, 2, but I think it's much higher now.
I think it's 3.
It's 3?
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't see
it's
that.
49% or 1,000, whichever's less.
So my concern is, I live in an apartment. My neighbor decides to start a business out of his apartment. It might be a huge apartment. He's using 49% of it. He has employees coming in and out all day long. He's producing commercial trash. He is using the electricity, water, sewer, How has any of this taken into consideration? Where does he put his commercial trash now? He's going to put it out with my residential trash. He's going to overflow. This is, I could see lots of issues with this.
No, yeah, I understand. I mean, so all of this, I should mention that, like, it is, in addition to the size parameters and all of the maximum number of employees and all that, there's a series of conditions associated with the home occupation to assure that it is compatible with the residential building. It cannot produce objective, noises, odors, all these other things, all litany of things actually that are designed to actually act as safeguards, like really legitimate safeguards. And if you do have a bad actor, they will continue to be, they could get a zoning violation for that if they're flagrantly, going against all those caveats embedded within the definition of home occupation. Yeah, no, I hear you. And this is, I should know that this came up a lot in public process. And it's a very legitimate thing. And one of the, I believe one of the points of agreement was that the Department of Buildings was going to get, money allocated to inspectors to be able to help on this front. So it's, I mean, I know. But.
Yeah, hi. My office does a lot, probably more than anybody else in the city, loft conversions, IMD buildings. So what he's describing back there is when people in these zones, and which then meant some of them changed to commercial zones, some even went to residential zones, but are illegally occupying in the building. And that was created because of a failure. Well, we can blame the owners for doing illegal things and tenants for doing illegal things. And it becomes a huge legal nightmare that goes on for years. There's one or two other people here who I know have dealt with them. And we get involved in that situation. The problem is it's created by the fact that we haven't increased the availability of residential space at a reasonable cost. And that's really what we're looking for. Maybe that's the third part of this lecture, which is what I'm here to see, is what are we doing about the residential increase? These situations were created because manufacturing had left the city, Port Jefferson or out to New Jersey, and these buildings could make more money by simply renting it to 110 illegal apartments or 30 illegal apartments or 5. And so they become what he's describing, can become very legally complicated. And so what's really needed is a flexibility and recognition that some of these areas, which were manufacturing zones, in not only being able to go residential, but also a recognition that many of the rules, and this goes to building code and multiple dwelling law, as to how these buildings can be made to accommodate residential life. So we got home occupations of all sorts going on in those buildings, and it's complicated. That's what I'm waiting to see and hear. This is the start of it here, but it's much more complicated.
We do have a conversion part of the
conversion part is very, very critical to this.
Yep. Stay tuned.
In 37, there was a definition for, and it's still there, for primary and secondary street frontages. Based on that, in 34, it used to permit and not permit certain uses on the first floor. Overnight, on June 6, 34 completely flipped, and street frontage, primary and secondary is meaningless. This is still in the definition. We have an application that was ongoing at the time of the change, and us and the building department, including chief plan examiners and the deputy commissioner, we all got lost because what do we do with this? We are a secondary. We were proposing the vice versa. We have a commercial space that's completely on a dead residential block, and it was being turned into an apartment. Overnight, nobody knows what to do with it because it's lost in translation. So what's the use of primary and secondary frontages as of now?
Yeah, so we had to keep some of those in 37 because they were referencing, sort of, there's many of the corridor standards in special districts, and that was easy to translate. But those were also being brought in to apply to things like the inner frontages of the plaza regulations, or other, they were referenced in design standards for public open spaces in special districts. So not necessarily streets, but if you had, a publicly accessible open space that's, stretching multiple blocks and is integral to a site plan, sometimes those had, ground floor frontage rules or transparency rules that were applied to them. So we had to keep those as sort of, to be able to have those links connected to them still. But yeah, I understand it's confusing. We're trying to weed them out over time, but we couldn't do all of them at the same time. I will note that it's one of the few places in this project, because it was a little more restrictive than the existing rules, we did put in vesting rules. So you might qualify for vesting rules for streetscape if it's something you want to use the old rules. They might be available to you.
It's on? Okay. I have concerns, but maybe there's answers to them. And one of them, the first one, is a few, but getting old, I don't remember the whole thing. But the fact that C1 and C2 were opening up the eating and drinking with entertainment. And in my days when I was a planning examiner over 30 years ago, we used to understand that C1 and C2, why we don't allow this, because we're protecting the quality of life for people living in the near district, in the residential, or the same on top of the building, above the commercial floor. Having that, beside the other issues, moral issues that I don't want to talk about it, but the attraction of traffic to these areas is going to be humongous. Imagine like a regular restaurant or an eating and drinking or a deli or something like that. Now I'm going to have an entertainment for 200 people within the same building. And look at the attraction of traffic and if this was addressed. The other thing is, one of the things that I personally, because I have a personal experience, was so proud of the city for our zoning is the location within buildings. Because for the same reason, when I was a planning examiner, I was trained to understand, because we're protecting the quality of life of the residential. The residential has to be always above the commercial, and in C1, not more than, I think, the second floor, the first floor, and the C2 allows the second floor. So when you have now, and beyond these, you have now commercial on the same floor as the apartment, and I'm giving you my personal experience. I'm Egyptian, and I went this summer to stay in my apartment in Cairo, and guess what? I have 2 units on the floor that one of them was a travel agent, and the other one was a storage in connection with a clothing store in the main avenue. And we, as a HOA in the building, we don't feel comfortable. Our kids using the same elevator as the people in the commercial people, the attraction to my floor. I don't know who's these strangers floating on my floor. So I blabbed and I said, no, not in New York. It's to be my job. No, we do not allow commercial to share floor or to be above residential. With seeing this happening, I see the quality of life for residential people are being jeopardized, especially at the time when we're trying to attract more people to live in the city and make the city really a desirable location, which always is desirable location to live in. This is my second concern. The other thing is a request, since really, and I've been doing this work for quite some time, since really the new use structure is totally revamping what we have been dealing with since '61. Is there a way to simplify? I am the applicant coming with some changes. I go on the website of city planning, I plug in some information, I come back with a beautiful certificate. Yes, this is what's allowed, and this is what's called, and this is what my, parking category is, and this and that. And I take that certificate, go to the building department, all online. I go to the building department. I already did my homework on the beautiful, beautiful matrix that city planning has on site. Is there something that's in the plan to do something like that? Thank you so much. That's all our work, guys.
I'll go in reverse order. Thank you for all that. Your last idea sounds great. There's nothing in the works yet. We worked closely with DOB to obviously conceptualize this and make sure they were comfortable with it. They had a lot of feedback to us. We worked with them. We tried to be responsive to them. They're getting comfortable with this. We've presented this to them. So all their plan examiners are hopefully getting up to speed. We don't have any tools yet to input your property and spit out whether it's compliant or not and what you are. But that's obviously business reform ideas like that are always great, and we should always be looking for ways to incorporate those. On the mixing of uses, I want to make clear that we weren't proposing to allow any sort of use of commercial and residence on the same floor with access between them. They have to have separate access all the way through. So you couldn't actually walk from the travel agency into the apartment. They have to be very separate. So if you're inside the space, you might not even know it's actually, on the same floor. It might feel like a wall, a partition. Yeah. It might feel exactly like that. You wouldn't even know. What we wanted to make sure is that, there's a lot of old buildings in the city. There's, the majority of our buildings are from prior to 1961 even. They could have doctor's offices and other things interspersed throughout the building, and it might not be the best use of them to transition to residence. They might be actually created, and better served as non-residential spaces. If you limit them just to community facility, you're really pigeonholing them. And if you could just give a little bit more flexibility to adapt to commercial over time, even if you put in some safeguards, maybe that's a better solution. And in terms of being above, totally agree and totally understand. And that's why we have a lot of safeguards in place to make sure that they're not incompatible with the residences. What we didn't want to, the opportunity that we really saw there is that if you wanted to have the restaurant on the top floor of a C6 district, like other cities have, the restaurant with the view on the top floor, why should we be against that? If you can, as long as you're separated and or have attenuation it's actually safeguarding the residences. So that's what we wanted to open up. And then in terms of the C1, C2 district distinction, I think what we were trying to make the line between the C1 and the C2 versus the C4, C5, and C6. We didn't want to bring the C4, C5, C6 rules down into the overlays. We wanted to keep them separate. But between the C1 and C2, restaurants are both allowed there. They are allowed today. The only restriction on the 200 was in the C2 district, and that's if you had entertainment. So we were equalizing that. If you had no entertainment, they were actually allowed without any size restriction today, or prior to ZO. So we were actually trying to equalize them all together. And if you wanted to have, the larger entertainment facilities, then we don't think they should operate in the C1 or C2 district. You should go to the C4, C5, C6. So that's sort of the short answer of it, that we weren't trying to really upend things. We were just trying to keep them specific to the context that they were in. In the neighborhood commercial, we were trying to equalize those things, and in the CBD districts, we were trying to equalize those things, not really upend the scale and allow the CBD uses in the local uses. I hope that helps somewhat.
Look, the beauty, the very difficult things when zoning, zoning resolution allows something and then throw it at the building department and say, go, make it happen, because it will never happen the way we intended to do. The whole idea is when I have a building and I separate the building with walls, and I'm going to have another set of stairs here, another set of stairs here, set of elevators here, set of elevators here. This is two building sections, separate buildings. That's not what you guys are looking for. We're looking for a city of yes. Everything is yes. So I am saying is you're allowing something on the books, like the other nightmare about the home occupation, right? Like the other, thing about having the greenhouse for production of food without city planning authorization. This is going to be living. This is going to be a beautiful penthouse in New York City. It means there's certain things that you guys allowed on the books, but for DOB to enforce, it's going to be a nightmare.
No, I hear you. Yep.
And I'm sorry, and I don't speak for the building department. I'm no longer there. Thank you so much and good luck.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Hi. So there's been a lot of complaints about City of Yes for economic opportunity. So before I lodge my complaint, I do want to say there's some fantastic things in here. I love that you can change among the commercial uses without getting a new C of O, and that's the real impact of what you've wrought here. I think that's fantastic. If I have a linoleum store more than 10,000 square feet, I can now go to a bodega, whatever it is. I can change that around. I don't need a C of O. That's fantastic. With respect to the supplemental use regulations, the location and buildings of commercial and residential uses that Fatma was just talking about, I understand that on the same floor, there can't be access in between them. But my understanding, if I understand it, is that with respect to the exit stairs and with respect to the elevators, you can take the same elevator and get off on one floor, it's apartments, and get off another floor, then it's offices. Is that correct? That's what I understand, at least.
I'm not sure. We'll look into it. Yeah.
If there are no other questions. So So unlike the other two projects, Carbon and Economic Opportunity, Housing Opportunity is still in public review, right? So we referred it to start public review back in April. It had gone to all the community boards, all the borough presidents. The City Planning Commission held their public hearing a couple weeks ago. It ran for like 14 straight hours. City Planning Commission is still reviewing it and then has to go to the City Council. So what we're going to present on this one is a little bit simplified because at the end of the day, we're still not sure what the rules are going to be because the City Planning Commission and the City Council still have to approve something. And as Chris sort of noted with economic opportunity, sometimes what we start the process with, often what we start the process with and what we end the process with will be very different. So I think we talked to Mark about this, if and when housing opportunity is approved, and the smoke clears and we know what actually got approved, we can come back and give a more detailed presentation. But what this does is at least gives a summary of the kind of core things that it's proposing to do. So this one's a little bit quicker, and I'll try to go through it as a bit faster. So at its core, similar to a lot of these other projects, it's really looking at the zoning resolution and trying to think about the ways that zoning can be an impediment to housing, and looking at it from the perspective of if we were able to allow a little bit more housing sort of across the city in different neighborhoods, that would be a better way to start to address the housing crisis rather than just thinking about an individual neighborhood taking on all the housing production of a borough or of the city as a whole. A lot of this is coming from the fact that, like, even though it's always been expensive to live in New York City, the costs and the difficulties of actually finding housing in the city really have gotten to a level that, like, I think has really, if ever been reached. You could read that by the vacancy rate. You can look at rent burden. You can look at the number of homeless people in the city. All of these things really are tied to housing and the costs of housing. A lot of this comes, at least to us, from a perspective of like, while we build a lot of housing in New York City, if you look at it as for the entire city as a whole, there's 8 million plus people here. That amount is actually pretty low when you look at other cities in the US as a percentage. And if you look at it historically, even though we've been building big towers and housing throughout the city for a while, it really doesn't look like anything that we had been building 50, 60 years ago. We really have hit this part where like we're not really producing that much housing, even if it may look like we are in the city. And then the other thing, that housing is really located in in only a couple neighborhoods in the city. If perhaps not surprising, but like along the East River in Brooklyn and Queens, the West Side and Manhattan really are where significant chunks of the housing in the city are. And you get to other parts of the city and you see little to no housing production. You actually see some areas and some neighborhoods where the amount of housing is actually going down as people convert, a 3-family building into a single-family building or a 2-family building. And so looking at these different things, trying to think about ways that in the different types of neighborhoods that we have in the city, what are housing tools and zoning tools that would allow us to begin to change some of these situations? So a couple different things, some of it focused on low density areas, and in zoning speak for us, that's R1 through R5, medium and high density, R6 through R10, and then some things that actually would become more citywide, sort of not dependent on the zoning districts. I'll go through them as just on the slides themselves. So for low density, a lot of the city's low density zoning rules, one of the things that I think we found was like the variety that actually exists in the city's low density neighborhoods from a building perspective is actually quite varied compared to what the zoning often is allowing. So you have areas where you'll see apartment buildings, but then the zoning, when you actually go and read it, may only be allowing a 2-family building, a single-family building. And even in the places that actually allow apartment buildings, all of the rules of zoning gang up on you and make it all but impossible to actually build a building that may literally exist across the street. So one of the kind of core things in the proposal, looking at the commercial districts, the commercial overlays, some of the things that Chris was talking about, making sure that the zoning actually allows, depending on what zoning district you are, the ability to build 3 to 5-story mixed-use buildings, including ground floor commercial or community facility uses, but then housing above that. To a surprising degree, that is really hard to make work in the zoning that we have on these corridors today. That would be expanded beyond commercial corridors in areas near transit, depending on the size of the lot and where it was located on the block. But the idea is to try to mimic what we were finding often was like this. You will see small-scale apartment buildings located in residential, what look on the zoning map as like 2-family districts or even single-family districts. But these buildings will be here, are non-conforming, non-complying, trying to allow buildings that generally match that in these areas. We'd also allow accessory dwelling units in single and 2-family houses. This could be in an attic, it could be in a yard, or anywhere else in the building. And the idea is to try to create a framework that will allow accessory dwelling units to exist in New York City, just like they do in a lot of others. Yeah.
So I've been skimming the PDF.
Yeah.
And under the, you guys are calling them not accessory, but ancillary dwelling units. If I'm correct, they have to be 5 feet from the property lines?
So if you're in a rear yard,
Right.
there are a number of existing permitted obstructions that are allowed in rear yard areas, like garages, right? Like
Right.
a parking garage, that also have those same rules. And so this would allow that in that same area.
Okay, so is there a reason 5 feet from the property lines? And if you've got a 20-foot rear, 20-foot wide site, you're
Right.
not going to get an ADU on it.
No, you're not. And that's reality. That's true. I think what we are doing is,
Well, I think you're missing an opportunity. I'm
Sure.
looking, I'm working on 2 houses on 20-foot lots in R4s.
okay,
They've got driveways, they've got garages.
yeah.
They should have an ADU.
They-
You can't do that with 5 foot from the property line.
So if the building, so actually, this is a great example of the kind of thing that like in those, it's 1,400 pages of zoning, 20 slides can never get to. We did write a lot of rules about non-complying structures. So really trying to do what a lot of other cities were finding was if you have that garage, it happens to exist there, and you want to like update that, often if you start using it for other purposes, it becomes non-compliant, right? The rules that are in, I think it's 54, 53, try to get at this and actually allow those spaces to be used for these purposes. Even if the thing is 3 feet from the yard, as long as it's an existing structure. Yeah, there are some rules for that thing too. If you look, it's trying to get at that stuff. But I would say with the accessory dwelling units, like one of the things that's like very clear when other cities have done this is you may allow it citywide, but like our lots are very unique. They're pretty small. And so you may not get a backyard ADU on every building in New York City, and that's okay. Like there may be, you may get it, you may get it in an attic, you may get it elsewhere, you may not get it at all. You may get a backyard ADU on a larger lot than we have. But we have a lot of different lot sizes in the city, and the idea is to try to like reflect that. It's the same as like the side yards that we have also proposed. I think it's trying, it's one of those things where it's like it's actually something that came up before. It's like the yard rules are there to also think about like the buildings in relation to the neighboring lots and trying to provide something there. You know, I think one of the things about all this stuff is we will see what we get approved. And then I think some of this is so new to New York City that I think it's one of those things that as we learn more, we may change these rules as we go, because we may learn that some things we thought made sense or we thought were needed, but we may find out maybe we don't over time.
I think you're going to end up with a lot of these like weird little spaces that you don't know what to do with, and they're going to like collect trash, drafts, things like that. So you'd be a whole lot better off building the things right to the property line and calling it ahead.
We'll see. I think we'll see as we go. Another thing that we were finding, and this actually is sort of relates to this, the zoning surprisingly often will say, well, you're not just allowing single-family houses, you could do two-family, you can do multifamily, but when you actually start to lay out the building and you deal with all the yards that are often 8 feet or the FAR that you actually have, it becomes really, really hard to actually make even a two-family building work. And when you look at like the other buildings that exist in the neighborhood, you find that the zoning is generally allowing smaller buildings than the existing structures that happen to be there. And so what we did try to do is beyond, say, the small apartment buildings like on town centers or accessory dwelling units, just trying to make sure that the just general rules for the existing or for a building actually tend to match. So like, you won't have to do 8-foot side yards, which you often would have to do in some zoning districts. You'd have more flexibility to actually locate the building and actually what we think is better match what actually happens to be in the neighborhoods. Yeah? Okay.
Hello.
Yay.
Hey, so you mentioned before about the changing the zoning to add residential above these commercial
Yeah.
one-story structures, is that going to be done with a map change, or is that going to be done as a change to the restrictions within that district designation?
Through text, so like if you happen to have a C overlay in a R4 district or something like that, these changes would allow, in different instances, more FAR, a different envelope.
So are there map changes?
Not as part of this.
Not as part of this at all.
Yeah, so it's trying to do, what we were trying to do is, given the existing zoning map, trying to think about what are appropriate, like, things that could allow more housing, but not change radically. Like, a two-family district is just generally a two-family district, not a multifamily district.
Right, but when you talk about New York City, the antiquated zoning, manufacturing districts that are no longer like Soho, and, there's manufacturing restrictions there, and there's no manufacturing going on there. So that's not really being addressed in terms of a map.
When we've done, what we've sort of in situations like, Soho is a great example, right? It used to just be a pure M district. We rezoned it 3 or 4 years ago to allow housing. And I think in sort of very particular situations like that, we think it makes sense to do more neighborhood by neighborhood. But when we're talking about like, should a two-family district actually allow two-family housing, we think yes, we should change the sort of text rules that are restricting that.
Thank you.
Skimming the text. I'm under the impression that for districts that allow one and two family houses, two-family houses, that you're getting rid of the density requirement for those districts?
So in those districts, there were 2 rules today. There was lot size and density. In LDGMA, so in Staten Island, LDGMA had a different framework that actually I think over time we found to be a better one, which is that you have just the minimum lot size. And if you have, say, a large lot, and you want to do a number of houses, you have to continuously meet that minimum lot size for each of the houses that you build. That's the LDGMA rule, and that's the rule that we tried to institute throughout for all sort of single and two-family districts, under the idea that then you don't really need the density factor because the lot size is controlling.
So if I've got a lot that is smaller than the new R4s, which I believe is 25 feet. So I've got a house that's on a 20 by 100.
It was an existing lot, I guess.
It's an existing house, existing lot.
Yep.
It's an R4. They want to turn it into a two-family.
They would be allowed to do that.
We would, because right now we can't do it because of
Yeah, it's a great example of one side of the zoning allowed existing lots that were smaller than the minimum lot size of that district to have single or where permitted two-family houses. But what we were often finding is if you actually tried to build that second family, the zoning just ganged up on you and made it all but impossible because you either had density factor or other rules that precluded it. And so we did change that to say essentially, if you're allowed a two-family house, you're going to be allowed a two-family house.
Okay.
As a simple example of that.
I'm also under the impression that you're doing the same thing with small lots. I'm looking at a property now that's on Manhattan Avenue, and it's 24 by 63, which is an undersized lot. But, under the new rules, I could put a 4-family on it.
You could do the apartment building that you would be permitted in that district. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we got a positive.
Regarding ADUs, let's say in R2 zones where you have a single-family district, and the way I looked at the zoning, the way it's the new text is it would permit a two-family and then a one-family district. Is that true?
It permits a single-family house of any size, and if you wanted to do a ancillary dwelling unit, it had to be limited to no more than 800 square feet.
Okay.
So the idea is it is still like, and that home, that unit is smaller and generally meant to be a secondary unit on that lot. But as a whole, outside of that allowance, it is meant to still be a single-family district.
to continue in that, the fire code currently requires when you have any dwelling unit that's more than 45 feet from the street or 40 feet from the street, we now need an FAR or a driveway or at least 20 feet wide to a 30 by 30 frontage space. And we have to do this all the time. So now you got this unit that's 10 feet from the back of your house, accessed by, I'll be sparingly, a 9-foot driveway.
Yeah.
And that'll be permitted, but fire code doesn't permit it.
That's right. And again, like keep in mind in that situation, we've seen people use attics, right? Like it doesn't always have to be a unit in the back. And a lot of that is just the reality of our lots are smaller. What we instead typically we see is someone use their attic. They may use a basement. They may just actually divide up their house into like half and half. And so like it's not that I think our expectation, just given the lot sizes and given the reality of just the buildings we have in the city, is where we would see accessory dwelling units will be different than like where Portland or Los Angeles, where like every lot's 5,000 square feet at least. So yeah, and then yes, are there other rules that are going to be there? Yes, the fire code's there. There are lots of rules that like the building code. What our sense was is unless the zoning changes, there's really no reason to think about changing all those other rules. And this is just trying to say, from a land use perspective, this may be allowed, but there still may be other rules that are going to be there that may limit it or may preclude it or may require you to locate it here as opposed to there on the lot. And that's okay.
Okay, I understand that, but all the...
We've only got 3 more questions left, and then we're going to have to close. There's a couple more people in the back who tried to end up a long time.
Okay, very good. I'm good.
Hi. Can you please clarify the ADUs for attics? How does that work? Especially with ceiling heights and habitable rooms and spaces?
Sorry, what?
ADUs and attics? How do you envision that working?
Like a 2-family house works. I think from a zoning, there may be building code things you're asking specifically about, but from just a land use perspective, that additional small unit can be located on the top of the building, on the bottom of the building, on the side of the building, or out in the back of the lot. The zoning is not trying to determine where that is, but give people the flexibility, knowing there are lots of different buildings and lots of different lots.
But it would still be categorized as a 1 unit with an accessory to that 1 unit, not necessarily changing the C of O to a 2-family.
I think that's right. You know, one of the areas we've looked at with DOB is like, when does the multiple dwelling law kick in, right? Where it's like 3 and above. And I think I think in the situation of I think what I would see is, because there's the 800 square foot restriction, the C of O may say single family dwelling, ancillary dwelling. It may add it, but not as a 2-family house, because that actually can become an issue if you're starting to get into fire code and having to do sprinklers, or if you're trying to deal with the MDL. That's the way, why we did it the way that we did.
My question was similar, relating to building code issues with the creation of new dwelling units, and where a building goes from R3 to R2, and there's many number of handicap accessibility, fire separation requirements that seem problematic. But I also have a question in the opposite direction, which is that, you know, there's a lot of projects that are taking 10, 20 family buildings and combining them into a single townhouse mansion, you know, that's maybe lived in for 2 weeks out of the year. And so in looking at all of these incentivizations, were there any discussions about putting obstacles, or maybe not prohibitions, but something, if someone would do this, take this much housing stock off the market, that there would be some kind of penalty to?
I think, I mean, we've heard that comment before. I think there are like, well, I'm not a lawyer, luckily, but there are some legal issues with trying to regulate maximum size housing that I think we were, I think we were looking to do other things because there were legal questions about whether that would be permitted in the city. Can I do one thing? Can I go through like 2 more slides just to make sure you know at least a couple other things that are in here, just for clarity? In medium and high density, some of you may know what the inclusionary housing program is, generally gave a higher FAR for affordable housing. Over time, we've tried to make it easier to fit that FAR. You get a higher height for it, all that fun, good stuff. That was only available in some locations. Only some neighborhoods had the inclusionary housing program. This brings it across all medium and high density districts, so everybody who wants to try to provide, generally it's about 20% of their housing as permanently affordable, gets a bigger building and gets the ability to fit it. The other thing I would say, parking. The proposed, usually we get something thrown at us, so it's weird. But just the proposal does try to remove the parking requirement for residential uses. And we did that proposed to do that citywide. I would say one of the more contentious parts of the project, and we will see what comes out of it. There's lots of other things I can direct Mark to. I know time is late. Of a lot of other kind of, I think would call smaller elements that try to address things like conversions, transfers of development rights, split lots, all the things that sort of like actually at their core may have made sense as a rule, but actually make it hard to build housing. And trying to come up with a sort of what we think of as sensible ways to address them. Haven't gotten as much play as some of the bigger aspects of the project. So we will see how those turn out as we go through public review.
All right, first I want to thank Chris and Frank for a wonderful presentation.